This is the appointed time, and we also have a quorum for the meeting, so I call this to order. In the interest of time, meanwhile, let me invite the administration to come in. Now, information paper issued since the last meeting. Please refer to the agenda. Right. Next, we should discuss items for discussion at the next meeting. On the 28th of October, the Secretariat issued a paper to members about the next meeting, which is scheduled for 2:30 p.m. the 19th of December, and the administration is proposed to discuss the following three items. First, Capital Works Reserve Fund block allocation for 2023-2024. And then second, studies related to artificial islands in the central waters. And then third item, proposed amendments to the Land Titles Ordinance, Cap 585. Members, do we agree to the three items to be discussed at the next meeting? If there is no objection, then these will be the items for discussion as suggested by the administration at the next meeting. Now, may I welcome the administration to our meeting. We're now at agenda item 3, development of multi-storey industrial buildings. I understand that a PowerPoint presentation will be given. Who will take us through the paper, please? Members, if you want to ask questions, please press the button now. Good afternoon. I'd like to brief members on the proposal of developing multi-storey industrial buildings. There are two objectives as far as the development of MSBs are concerned. First, through planned and concentrated accommodation approach, we want to fulfill the dual objectives of promoting industrial development and consolidating brownfield operations in a land-efficient manner. We also strive to provide assistance to brownfield operators who are displaced and are interested in continuing with their operation. Take the Northern Metropolis as an example. In Hon Kenneth New Development Area and Yuen Long South Development Area, we have reserved some 61 and 11 hectares respectively for industrial and logistic uses, and the sites can also be made available for the development of multi-storey industrial buildings. In future NDAs, such as the San Tin Lok Ma Chau logistics node, there would also be land available for MSBs. For Long Kwo Tan Reclamation and Tuen Mun West, there will also be land released for the development of multi-storey industrial buildings. About the 72 hectares reserved in Hon Kenneth and Yuen Long South, they are located very close to the airport, so they're at the premier location and they are close to infrastructure facilities as well. They will help boost the industrial development, and the land can support a diversity of developments such as the logistics and port backup facilities, as well as other industrial uses. The current plot ratio are from 5 to 7, and the MSB sites would produce around 3.9 million square meters of floor space, so that's 39 hectares of land. About the first batch of MSB sites reserved, we will start with the 3 sites at Hon Kenneth NDA, the 2 sites and the 3 sites near Yuen Long Industrial Estate. So these 2 batches of land will be made available at an earlier stage. And earlier, We confirmed through studies the architectural and technical feasibility of purpose-built MSBs on these 5 sites. Altogether, some 720,000 square meters of floor area will be made available. For the 3 sites at Yuen Long Industrial Estate, they will be ready for sale starting 2023. As for the 8 hectares of land or so in Hung Shui Kiu, Hachun, at the moment, the site is used for the accommodation of mobile hospitals. So, depending on when the facility will be decommissioned, the sites will eventually be made available. And in order to gauge the market response, we have commissioned a consultant to conduct a market sounding exercise to ascertain the market interest towards the development of MSBs on these sites. And we understand that for logistics and vehicle-related sectors, they are interested in taking forward operations in the MSBs. And we understand that the market is not opposed to an implementation approach which involves special land sale conditions to achieve the policy objective of consolidating brownfield sites and upgrading their operations. So we recommend open cash tender be implemented for the sale of the first 5 sites as mentioned. And we propose the following. The successful bidder will need to set aside no less than 30% of the floor space for government to provide the floor area for operations. And then the government department or an agency will then lease the designated portion to brownfield operators. And the tenancy will be set at about a tenure of the tenancy will be set at about 5 to 10 years. And then reference will be made to the market rent for existing brownfield sites. And then, let me recap, some 30% of floor space set aside for the government, and then it will be leased to brownfield operators, and then a concessionary rental will be provided for a rental period of 5 to 10 years. We're going to help displaced brownfield operators to continue with their operation in the MSBs, and this is one way of providing assistance to them. And we also provide monetary compensation for affectees, whereas for displaced operators who are interested in reprovisioning their operations, we will provide land and planning advice if they're able to find another site. Also, we'll also allow bidding by these affected operators for short-term tenancy sites by restricted tender. So we provide assistance to the affected operators in terms of reprovisioning. And MSBs is just one way of providing assistance. The main idea is to provide compensation. As for our next step, we're going to conduct an invitation of expression of interest exercise next year to further ascertain the market interest in the proposed disposal mechanism. And then in the latter half of next year, we will be selling the first batch of sites. And that concludes my presentation. Anything to add, Secretary? If not, then the floor is now open. Let me read out the names. In this order, Dr. LAU Ip-keung, Mr. Michael Tian, Mr. Frankie Yik, Mr. Edward Lau, Mr. Andrew Lam, Dr. Wendy Wong, Mr. Lee Shun-keung, Ms. Chen Yut-ming, and Dr. Stephen Wong, and Mr. Stanley Ng. We start with Dr. LAU Ip-keung. 4 minutes, questions and answers included. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, in the light of economic development, there may be changes to the existing brownfield operations. That means government will resume land for housing purposes. I don't think anyone will object to this policy objective because we don't really have an alternative. However, regardless of the economic value, brownfield sites are an important component of major industries. So the government is taking forward the development of multi-storey industrial buildings for reprovisioning the brownfield operations. I support the policy. However, you also mentioned two options. The second option is monetary compensation, and you describe it as the main option. That means you can retire as long as you get compensation. Now, if the operations are crucial to support industrial developments, then instead of only looking at MSBs, you should provide assistance to reprovision these operations. My sector is very concerned. On various occasions in this council, whenever we discuss the issues, I often mention that we have large machinery deployed at different construction sites, and in the interim, we need a yard to house them and for servicing and repair, just like the Wang Chao housing production case. So for the construction industry, you need to have regard to the whole chain of operation. So this third option is really important to many industries, and it seems you are deflecting this point. So definitely there will be successes to the existing operators taking forward development in the MSBs, and I'm concerned whether there is sufficient room for them. Who will take the question, please? Secretary, we're not shunning the issue. Dr. Lau just now mentioned the construction industry as an example, and that their operations cannot be housed in a multi-storey industrial building. Of course, we understand for larger machinery such as a tower crane, it would be quite impossible to store them in a multi-storey building. So we do admit that assistance is needed for brownfield operators to identify the site for replacement. It's not so much an access, but it is still, after all, an important point. With consolidated data in terms of land in the new territories, we've set out the list of possible sites, and that if you apply with the Town Planning Board for rezoning, these are available sites as per the list. And also, the Lands Department will act as a frontline agent in maintaining liaison. And at the level of the Bureau, as our next agenda item suggests, we are going to create a supernumerary post to take up coordination work at the Bureau level. Just let me supplement, Chairman. As far as idle sites are concerned, the government should do its level best to make sure that more idle sites are available for use, because you need to make sure that sufficient reserve land is provided for the shuffling of machinery, because otherwise we will be facing the predicament that we already face.
Thank you. I hope the government will take into account the brownfield site operators who are contributing to our economy and cannot be relocated to MSB, how we can help and support them. Next, Mr. Michael Tian. Thank you, Chair. Secretary, you are well aware that a lot of the industries are closely related to the economic development of Hong Kong, and it is not good for them to go out of business. I asked for one-to-one reprovision, but still you do not agree to that. Now you are saying that about the designated portion of about 30% of the MSB will be given to the government for use, and they will be rented out to the brownfield site operators at prevailing market rent. I thank you for this measure. For the 30% of the floor areas in these MSB, would it be sufficient to accommodate all the brownfield site operators who are displaced? We also talk about the existing factory buildings. They have to line up a lot for the lift service, and then a lot of vehicles are queuing for loading and unloading at such industrial buildings. So it is efficient if the lorries or containers can go to each story of the industrial buildings. And I welcome that now you actually have vehicular access that goes to the top floor of the industrial buildings. But are you allowing lorries or containers to go up there? Because, containers are much heavier and the construction cost will be much greater. So I hope that you will try to arrange for Type A and Type B vehicular access, one for lorries and the other one for containers. I think for a lot of the industries like catering, they can make use of lorries for transportation, but for exporting of goods, they may need to use containers. So as a whole, would you try to take this category A, B vehicular access into account when you try to build the MSWs? If you allow both types of vehicles to have access, then you'll be wasting the space. Another related issue is that you talk about MSBs, but people are not quite clear about them. Can you call them the modern industrial buildings? Our country talk about modernization these days, and all the lorries can go all the way up to the top floor of the building. This is modernization. Can you take that into account? Lastly, for the brownfield operators, they may stop operation for a while and they have to wait for a number of years before they can rent your MSW spaces. So they would have to go out and rent other sites which are more expensive. Will you do anything to help them during this interim period? Well, thank you, Mr. Tin, for the suggestions regarding the MSWs, whether we should call them the modernized industrial buildings. Well, as pointed out in our PowerPoint just now, we have a dual purpose in developing the MSWs. First is to help our brownfield operators who have been displaced. The second objective is to support the development of modern industries in Hong Kong. So for the terminology of the buildings, we'll take that into consideration. Mr. Tan also asked for the first phase of buildings. It will only be available by 2027 or 28, and by that time, some of the brownfield sites will be cleared. Also, you asked whether there is sufficient space for accommodating the displaced brownfield operators. I can give you a brief explanation. Between now to 2027, that is before the commencement of the first batch of MSWs, we have to clear about 200 hectares of brownfield sites. So even if we don't have the one-to-one reprovision, I think apart from monetary provision, we also have to find sites for these brownfield operators to be accommodated. But then, of course, some of them may go out of business because of competition, etc. So in the past few years, actually, we have some successful examples. Some of these brownfield operators in the past years are able to get new sites through STTs. After 2026, the number of brownfield sites that need to be cleared is about 700 hectares. So today, we have identified Hong Kiew, Yuen Long South, mentioned by my Deputy Secretary just now. Even if take into account all the plot ratios, we can only provide about 400 hectare floor space. But we have a problem of accommodating 700 hectares of brownfield operations, so obviously it is insufficient. So that's why we need to take a multi-pronged approach. But for the Northern Metropolis, we are actually having a lot of planning work undergoing, and we want to support the development of our industries. We hope that there will be more sites available from then. As regards the 30% designated portion that will be set aside for our brownfield operators, I think let's look at the situation of the first batch, and then we can adjust this percentage as appropriate. Also, we will try to look for open area sites. For vehicular access, as regards the width, because we're talking about modern industries, as Mr. Tin, you have pointed out, we can't just have one model. So for the first batch, we will try to have an expression of interest exercise. And before that, we'll try to gauge the market reaction to see whether they want to go for logistics industry or regular maintenance and repair industry. So we will do more study on that respect. Thanks. Mr. Tan also asked you to consider whether you would look into the efficiency of vehicle access accommodating lorries and or containers. So if you go for more efficient ones, then people would maybe just go for lorries. Or if you have a vehicular access accommodating containers, that will be more expensive. So please look into this. Next, Mr. Frankie Yip. Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the administration. They have adhered to the suggestions of the industry. And we hope that with the commencement of the MSB, about 30% of the floor area will be used to be taken up by the government and will be rented out to the operators for about 5 to 10 years according to market rent. This is welcomed by the industry. I also have several concerns. First, when you map out the details of the proposal, please look at the rent level. For the administration, please note that for the go-downs in the brownfield sites is usually about 11 meters high, and the MSB only have a floor height of about 7 to 8 meters. And Mr. Tan had talked about vehicular access. We see that for the buildings in Kwai Ching, there is only utilization of about 60% right now. So if you want to accommodate the same amount of goods, then I think the floor areas would have to be expanded by 2.3 times. So if it's only $12 for a square feet, that means you have to pay a bit more, and you need about 28.2 square feet for accommodating the goods. Also, for the time frame, I think 5 years is too short. For the logistics industry, we're going for automation. We would not rely on manual labor. So with automation, we need more time period, for the machinery to be depreciated. So please give a time frame of no less than 10 years. For the third point, the industry is appreciative of the developments and hope that in future that you will build the MSW before you resume the land, because if you can't have a seamless provision of the MSWs, the operators cannot just cease operation for about a few years for the MSW to be built. You said that you're working out on a checklist of the sites available for accommodating the operators who will be affected, so that they can go to you early to apply for a new site. And also you have to play the role of a facilitator, because time is of essence. So I hope you would take these into account when you take forward the proposals. Thank you. Secretary, several points are actually suggestions from Mr. Yip, and we will take that into account. For the designated portion of about 30% of the floor area, we want to rent them out according to market rent. And we will look at the rent that is comparable to the renting of current brownfield sites. There is also a suggestion as to whether we can relocate the industry first before land resumption. But as I have said before, we're not going for one-to-one reprovisioning. So in the past, when we try to plan Hung Shui-Kiu or Putong North, we are not able to achieve that because we are very concerned about the provision of housing units. So that's why we try to clear the site as soon as possible so as to build the buildings. But with the development of the northern metropolis, we are looking at a much greater area. If the land supply is better and the demand for housing units is less severe, then we hope that we can provide the floor space and have a better timing for accommodating the brownfield operators so that they will not be displaced for a long time. I think Mr. Yip pointed out is that the market rent may not be that optimal for the operators because for some of the MSW, the height of each floor is not that high, and it is different from the current situation in the brownfield sites, and there is a gap of about 2.3 times. So when you set the rent, please take that into account. Otherwise, they will be paying a much higher rent than existing situation. Next, Mr. Lau Kwok-fan. Thank you, Chairman. I support the proposal of developing MSBs. I think in the past we only rely on monetary compensation as the key measure, but this time we're having a more systematic measure to provide sites for accommodating brownfield operations. I note that this time there will be 5 MSB coming out, and 30% of the floor space will be given to the government, and it will be about 23 hectares in total. But for the coming 5 years, there are some 200 hectares of brownfield sites which need to be resumed. So it is obviously not sufficient. So I would like to ask the Secretary, how are you going to apportion the designated area that you will be getting the 30%. For the brownfield operators, they engage in different industries. Their operation require different loading and different floor heights. Some of them are paying rent at about $3 to $5 per feet, and some are paying higher rent of maybe about some $10 per square feet. So which type are you looking at when you set the market rental? Also, I would like to know whether you have a more fair and transparent mechanism as to how you will dish out this 23 hectares of land to the brownfield operators who are displaced. So is there a mechanism for it? I think if this measure can be rolled out 2 or 3 years earlier, it will be better. I think if you're going to have a STT next year, the buildings can only be available in about 2026 or 27. But as we pointed out, there are about 200 hectares of brownfield sites that will be affected. So what are you going to do in the interim? There is a time gap of several years. So what will be the transitional arrangements before the operators can move to the MSBs? Lastly, there are certain operators who have huge construction machinery and they cannot be relocated to buildings. And you only have a few area for open air operation, which is about only 3 hectares. So this is far from adequate. So can you try to identify more sites for open air go down purposes? Secretary?
Chairman, comparable level of rent, we understand that for brownfield operations, there may be a range of rent for different sites. Some are covered, some are not. So when we implement this mechanism, we will impose a range as well. We don't just take the average. That depends on the types of operations and the types of brownfield sites. We mentioned that the MSBs won't be completed until 2026-27, and we still have some time to go to iron out the details. our work at the moment focuses on conducting an analysis on the previous brownfield clearance exercises, the nature of the operations, for example, and the size. And in the past, we did not conduct a more detailed analysis on exactly what types of operations are involved. So in the future, if the government leases the MSBs and introduces a rental mechanism, a tendering exercise will not be carried out. Instead, we will try to pull together the different information and try not to put incompatible operations in the same building. We'll also have regard to the important contributions of the operations to our economic activities. So we need to iron out the details first. And we adopt a multi-pronged strategy. As I mentioned just now, we will continue to identify sites for the reprovisioning of brownfield operations, and we will be providing more case examples for members' reference. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam. Other members already asked some really important questions, but I'm more concerned about the supply chain or the chain of operations. We need to be mindful about every step of the operation. At the macro level, I understand that we need to take a multi-pronged approach, and I understand that the Development Bureau, especially the frontline colleagues, have been making dedicated effort to follow up on each and every case. But you need to plan holistically instead of implementing stopgap measures. Now, regarding MSBs, I think the administration is also aware of the supply-demand imbalance. In other words, there is a mismatch regarding the floor space provided and the operations to be accommodated. And there is also a problem with timing. As mentioned by other members, my concern is exactly this. Of course, another market sounding exercise will be conducted when you issue a tender. You need to set out in detail the operational requirements. Otherwise, I'm afraid that your exercise will be futile. Also, I understand the government will be in charge of the operation of the MSBs. That's what I've read in the paper. So I understand that the government is actively responding to the demands, but I don't see a comprehensive strategy. I am delighted to see in this year's policy address that we do not have any target, and we're going to have land support for the industrial developments. Land is required, but my concern is whether the responsibility of looking into the various sites should fall squarely on the shoulders of Development Bureau only, because apart from normal industrial operations, what about container yards? What about the storage of large machinery? What about other industries, recycling, construction, rural and industrial operations? I've yet to see these details, and I don't think the Development Bureau can singly handle these issues. If we take it to the level of, say, the deputy CS, we should make sure that there is coordination a coordinated approach in studying different industries so that we can formulate a comprehensive policy. And as mentioned by other members, we also need to implement medium to long-term reprovisioning arrangements for the affected operations, because not all operations can continue in MSBs. Secretary, anything to add? I fully agree with the Honourable Member that the Development Bureau is not the only bureau responsible for the various industries in Hong Kong, and we cannot singly tackle the problems by ourselves. We earlier conducted a market sounding exercise, and according to the paper, modern logistics and vehicle-related industries are most interested in MSBs. We have been liaising with the Transport and Logistics Bureau as well. So about the 70% of floor space as per our development model, we have received input from the Transport and Logistics Bureau. And about the recycling industry, the EEB likewise is prepared to take forward the relevant portion under its portfolio. Well, you mentioned other industries. Of course, we have diverse industries, and by then we will approach the relevant bureaus. Under the current mechanism, there are 2 occasions on which a dedicated officer will be tasked with overseeing the project. Let's say Northern Metropolis Development Strategy, the Chief Executive will personally provide steering and oversee its implementation. And we also have a task force on land supply, and this is chaired by the Financial Secretary. So these 2 committees or task forces will be discussing the relevant issues, and we also have members of these committees from our bureau. So about the axis and the details of these policies, we have the dedicated lead bureau. Next, Dr. Wendy Hong. Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I thank the bureau for having held an in-depth discussion with us before proposing the creation of a post. Now I like to say a few words about brownfield operations. We support consolidating brownfield sites and taking forward the development of MSBs. But recently I've come across some cases. Some of them are brownfield operators, some are not, and they face uncertainties in terms of the short-term tenancies available, be it private or government land. Usually, they are leased to industrial operators on a rather short-term basis. That means a tenure of 3 to 5 years or 7 years at most. Some operations may require a longer investment horizon. And these operations cannot be upgraded or transformed if they can only work on short-term sites. And many tenancy agreements have a validity of just 1 to 2 years, and it's really difficult to find an alternative site. They are unsure when they will need to move again. So will the government consider providing a longer tenure, especially for industries requiring a longer investment horizon, or industries which should be upgraded or transformed, so that with a longer tenancy period they can undertake a longer term investment. The other point is take Long Gu Tan reclamation and replanning of Tuen Mun West as an example. We've been talking about the developments for over a decade. We even talked about reclamation for a long time, and still decision has yet to be made. And for industries requiring longer term planning, again, they are unsure when they will need to move. We really need to expedite a pace of development and ascertain different land uses. to provide certainty for operators. Secretary. Chairman. Let me explain succinctly the difference between short-term tenancies and the land lease. For short-term tenancies, we require quarterly rent. We charge quarterly rent, and the maximum period will not go beyond 7 years. If it goes beyond 7 years, it's kind of a land lease, and the operator, first of all, will need to pay the land premium upfront. So, meanwhile, some operators have told us that they prefer short-term tenancies instead of having to pay the land premium upfront. And we've also heard about complaints of the tenancies being too short, just 1 or 2 years. So we've improved the measure to support the operators, and we now have a tenancy period of 5 years in general. As long as there is no imminent need to repossess the site for other uses, we will tender out the sites on a longer tenure. As far as we know, there are different operations on these sites. Some are car parks, and they usually sign a 3-year tenancy agreement. Some may require a longer investment period, hence a longer tenancy period. There is no hard and fast rule, but we strive to maximize the tenancy period to up to 7 years if need be. Dr. Hong asked whether we can complete the study as quickly as possible to address or to provide more certainty. It's a fluid process. We're doing our best to shorten the time required for the study. Say Northern Metropolis, in its latter half of next year, we target the completion of certain studies. As for Long Ko Tan and Tuen Mun West, we also seek to apply for funding with LegCo as quickly as possible to initiate a study, because I agree that previously, when we discussed reclamation in this council, there were quite some controversies. Now we want to work full steam. Mr. Lee Chen-keung, I'm happy to see that the government has adopted a new mindset to take forward the development of brownfield operations as well as other industries. Many members just gave a lot of comments to the government about the different problems facing different industries, including land uses and the space required. Now, the Liberal Party always advocates grasping the opportunities presented in the 14th Five-Year Plan so that we make good use of brownfield sites, and that there should be a seamless transition as we take forward MSBs. For example, for the logistics sector, if we provision them near the boundary, we will be able to address, for example, traffic congestion in Kwai-ting, and also address the issue of pollution and improve people's livelihood. So it will be a win-win situation. So for the logistics industry, apart from the brownfield sites, you can have another stock-taking exercise and give us a blueprint about the existing land uses. About the 30% designated portion to be set aside, we support the idea, and we hope that the designated portion can be used by the relevant industries, such as auto repairing. Can we have a licensing office housed in the same building for testing and certification?
都提及租金。
Several members have touched upon the concessionary rental. I would like to suggest that for the administration, when you try to build the buildings, be careful when you look at the ramps to be built. Take reference to the buildings in Shanghai. You will try to have a Y-shaped vehicular access, and so as to reduce the space for building the regular access, and there will be more floor space to be used. Thank you, Chair. Secretary, Mr. Lee, you have a suggestion about the design of the building. We note that. We will bring that back to our design team. You also suggest that we should try to find more sites for the use by the logistics industry. Well, as Mr. Tian has said earlier, we are now talking about the modern industrial buildings. They are dual objectives. One of them is for the modern industries, which include logistics. So when we try to look at the Northern Metropolis or the other relevant studies, there will be suggestions regarding this industry. It is natural to have more logistics facilities because they are close to the port. For the designated portion, the 30% of the floor space, we'll try to set them aside for use by brownfield operators. We are asked as to how we are going to dish out this 30% of the floor space. We would try to look at the question of compatibility. We would try to see whether the uses of the 30% floor space will be compatible to the uses of the remaining 70% floor space. So we'll try to come up with feasible combinations. Well, I think actually you can have childcare facilities in the 30% of the floor space so that the citizens can let the children stay there and then they work downstairs. So try to be more innovative and creative when you look at the use of the designated portion. Next, Ms. Chen Yip-ming. Thank you, Chairman. Well, this paper only touched on Hong Kenneth LAU Ip-keung and the Yuen Long South Development Area. So they are both on the western side of the Northern Metropolis, and we're talking about only 72 hectares. It also talks about the other areas concerning Hong Kenneth and Yuen Long. Well, I have some questions. For the MSB is going to accommodate modern logistics and also vehicular servicing and maintenance. And you will have ingress and egress, differentiated from the western side. So we're all talking about the western side of the Northern Metropolis, where it is close to the airport. So I would like to know, with the development of Mankamto, it will not be used for logistics, and so the role of Hengyuan will be even more important. So if you look at the map that I have at hand, I got it from the planning department. It is from a study of the brownfield sites. So you can see that in the Ta Kwu Leng area, there are a lot of brownfield operations. And so what are the plans for the eastern part of the North District? Why don't you think of building MSB in North District? And you can't have ingress and egress from the eastern side. So are you having a major policy change here? Or can you let us have some supplementary information? Also for Kutong North and Yuen Long South, I have questions about the development. There are a lot of brownfield sites to be displaced there. So what are the plans for accommodating them? They have to find sites themselves for reprovisioning, and the government will assess their application. But in Kutong North, there are a lot of wood operations which have to be moved out. And that vehicular access that carriageway is being widened. So this will lead to livelihood issues. We can't allow for the brownfield operations to move close to the boundary control points. This is not solving the issue at the crux. So I would like to know when you have a systematic measure of accommodating the brownfield operations. So when will the MSWs be built and commenced, how long can these MSBs be used? Secretary. Well, Ms. Chan's first observation focuses on paragraph 3 of the paper. We have mentioned that we have set aside sites for the development of modern logistics. We also mentioned that there are other possible use for Lin Tong Hangyuan and Man Kam To. It is also possible for the developments, but because Northern Metropolis covers a large area, so we have not set out all the details. But by the end of next year, when the information is available, members will notice that we have actually reserved sites for the development of modern logistics. Ms. Chen has also pointed out that for some brownfield operators, they have moved to Taku Lane, and she's concerned about the development of modern industries there in future. Right now, we're actually having a difficult situation because we have to find space for accommodating the brownfield operations before the MSBs come into place. So maybe we have to use STTs to accommodate them. But when there is a long-term development plan, then it will go beyond for a long time. Now we are talking about the multi-industrial buildings. When they are built, they will be permanent facilities. 70% of the floor areas will be used by the successful bidder of the building. For the remaining 30%, as stated in the paper, it will be taken up by the government. So the government will be the owner, and the government will rent the space out to the brownfield operators. And first of all, we will give them a concessionary rental during the initial period of 5 to 10 years. Some members have pointed out that 5 years is too short, and they would like to have at least 10 years. We will take that into consideration. But after the space has been used by one operator, the government is still the owner, and the government will consider how to rent out the space after the initial 5 to 10 years. Next, Dr. Stephen Wong. Chairman, I support the proposal of developing MSBs to support logistics developments, etc. Point number 1. If we want them to upgrade their operations, I think Mr. Andrew Lam has pointed out that it is necessary to have a policy support for such industry development. If there is no policy support for them, it may be difficult for them to grow. They would need financial, technical support, etc., and they cannot be upgraded within 5 to 10 years. But for the support services, I think it may have to be provided by other policy bureau like the Transport and Logistics Bureau. So when we talk about the relocation of the brownfield operations, I think you have to work hand in hand with the relevant policy bureau and have a more comprehensive plan. When we talk about brownfield sites, I think we have to look at the bigger pictures. Today we talk about MSBs, but I think we need to look at the bigger picture. Dr. LAU Ip-keung has pointed out that when we relocate the brownfield operation, is it possible to find sites of similar use for them? For example, in the case of transitional housing, we try to use the idle government sites for transitional arrangements. So we have the site maybe for the more low-rise brownfield operations. As Ms. Chan Yut-ming has pointed out, so if they are relocated from the brownfield operations to the temporary sites before they move to more permanent sites, can they be served as sort of more backyard operations in terms of economic development? For example, we may have the more green sites for them. Thirdly, we think that it is difficult to get back to brownfield sites. And after getting the site, it is difficult to accommodate the brownfield operators. So from the strategic point of view, should we try to have more private public sector partnership in terms of land resumption? So don't just rely on the government to think about how to resume the facilities and how to upgrade the operations. Can you work with the private sector? The third point is a comment. Well, instead of calling them brownfield sites, can we call them sites related to logistics development which are not well planned yet? And we will try to resolve the problem at hand. Secretary, Dr. Wong's first point touches upon support for industrial policy for the brownfield operators to move to the MSBs. We fully agree with that. If the brownfield operations falls under the industry of a particular policy bureau, then we will try to get input from that relevant bureau. For the government, we'll be having 30% of the floor space as the designated portion, where at this stage it is just a plan. We are thinking whether we can ask the Productivity Council or similar organizations to come and operate these floor space for us, because they have experience in supporting the development of the brownfield operations. So this is just a thought. And we don't have to have one operator for all the floor space to be taken up by the government. So depending on the need, maybe the government can invite the relevant organization and teams to help the brownfield operators to upgrade their operations. Secondly, about the use of the private sector help. Well, this time actually we are trying to make use of market forces for the development of MSBs. Following the issuance of this paper, I noticed that there are views as to why the government do not build the multi-industrial buildings ourselves. We are now trying to invite private operators to build them. The reason is that we want to make use of market forces, and we don't have to make use of public funding. So public funds can be used for other livelihood projects, and then the private sector can come in and construct the buildings, and then they will give us some of the floor space so that we can take care of the displaced brownfield operators. So we are hoping that the government can work in tandem with the private sector. We can work in collaboration. Dr. Wong asked whether we can have more transitional sites for backyard economic activities. As I have said before, we are adopting a multi-pronged approach. We are coordinating the information, and we hope that the Bureau and the departments concerned, there will be dedicated colleagues to look at the management of these cases. Next, Mr. Stanley Ng. Chairman, my party agreed that we should consolidate the brownfield operations and make optimal use of the brownfield sites so that we can try to find more sites for building houses. We have three issues which we think the public is more concerned about. First, now the isolation facilities are being used as industrial buildings. Chairman, you may be aware that some members have pointed out whether these temporary hospitals can be used as transitional housing as the pandemic situation has eased. But I think obviously the government has not considered this proposal. And for the case of Ha-Chun, it will not be used for transitional housing, but it will be used as multi-storey industrial buildings. So I would like to know whether the government has new thinking in this respect. So are you giving a lower priority to transitional housing now? The pandemic situation is still at a flux. How can you decide whether or not these isolation facilities are needed or not. Second issue.
About the paper, it is suggested that a market sounding exercise was conducted. So, because we're still in the midst of the pandemic, I wonder if the exercise has successfully helped us gain a correct picture of the situation. How do you ensure that the exercise has been an accurate one that could help us meet future needs? And about the 65 hectares of terminal at Tuen Mun West is supposed to be for cargo freight by water. Now we have Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge. My question is whether the terminal would provide an expedient way of cargo consignment instead of relying on land transport. 3 questions. Secretary, regarding the 2 sites reserved at Hong Shui Kiu, before they have been acquired for building cabin hospitals, we've already planned for the sites to be used as port backup facilities and logistics uses. In other words, all along we've planned to use the sites as for modern logistic purposes, but because of the epidemic, the sites have been used for providing temporary hospitals. When the epidemic subsides, when there is no more need to have temporary hospitals there, the sites will be reverted to their original use. So it's not the case that we are putting the idea of light public housing on transitional housing on the back burner. We instead want to revert the sites to their original uses. Otherwise, the industries and the brownfield operators will be affected. Second point, I agree with Mr. Ng that when we engage a consultant to undertake a market sounding exercise, we came up with a suggestion from the exercise that the logistics and vehicle-related sectors are interested in bidding and developing MSBs. And yet there have been changes because of the epidemic in our economy. And this is exactly why another succinct market sounding exercise will be conducted, which will be focusing on the sites near Yuen Long Industrial Estates, which will be put up for tender very soon. And the exercise will also provide more details, such as the requirement of setting aside no less than 30% of the floor space and when construction is to take place. The exercise or EOI exercise will help us with the tender. Now next, when we conduct a planning study, we will have full regard to the changes brought about by the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge in terms of connectivity and economic activities, as well as the Northern Metropolis Development Strategy. And that's Lau Fau Shan, Pak Nai, and in fact next to it is Long Ku Tan and Tuen Mun West. So when there are changes in the vicinity, we will be given a better or will be in a better position to take forward this planning study. Next, Mr. Kenneth Lau. Chairman, the 5 sites in Yuen Long Hong Shui Kiu comprise 72 hectares, and it is said that MSBs can be developed to accommodate brownfield operators, and according to the paper, with plot ratios from 5 to 7, these sites could produce 3.9 million square meters of floor space. And I heard members' concerns there is a consensus that NT sites should be consolidated so that brownfield operators can continue to make a living and do business in MSBs. But as we all know, in the 40 years of the mainland's reform and opening up, many operators started their operations on brownfield sites, which were originally farmland for storage and backup, and that's how we come by brownfield sites nowadays. And there is a misconception that brownfield sites are taking away opportunities to provide housing, and that's I think the government should level with the public the reason. Now, one-to-one reprovisioning is not possible. So will the government consider fine-tuning the planning of the Northern Metropolis Development Strategy? Because I see that we have deserted farmland in Northern Metropolis, deserted fish ponds and farmland spanning 1,000 hectares. So in terms of enhancing speed and efficiency, quality, especially in quantity, will you fine-tune the land resumption exercise in Northern Metropolis? Secretary, Northern Metropolis is a large project for Ping Che, Tai Po, Cho Long Hang, which is within the scope of the study. We're talking about over 1,000 hectares of land. So in our proposal, there should be land available to support industrial operations. We need to provide open space for modern and clean operations. As I said before, we'd like to build Hong Kong into a hub for MIC and modular integrated construction method, which is an advanced operation requiring open space. So we believe that in the Northern Metropolis in the future, there will be space available for such operations. And Mr. Lau just said that we should explain to the public about brownfield operations and their merits. And like I explained, we have some major brownfield operations that are properly managed, and I must admit, and yet there are also operations that cause pollution and that are not using land in an efficient manner. So we cannot use a broad brush approach when we describe brownfield operations. Ms. Doreen Kong. Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I support the government's proposal, but I'd like to make the following points. First, I understand that to some extent we have private participation. The construction phase will be undertaken by private developers, and 30% will be set aside as designated portion. And of course, this will help fund the project instead of forking out money from the public coffers. But we have a 70% private, 30% public mix. Then I'm concerned that, Secretary, your plan may not be as flexible. Because this is a novel concept. So in the future, if we are to revise the design or the mix, if the land is privately owned, we won't be as flexible in doing that. I understand that you're going to introduce as a pilot the model on 5 sites. So my first question is whether you should invite private participation. Second, I wonder if this is, after all, an industrial building. If we call it an industrial building, then in terms of the construction process and building requirements, there may be an implication. Now, you talk about modernized industrial building. I wonder whether we should adopt this terminology. Because what about other industrial buildings in Hong Kong? Are they modern or not? I'm concerned about the possible confusion. Third point, about the land application process. If there is private participation, once again, I'm concerned. For example, in your land lease condition, will you stipulate the exact industrial use? Say if you have a 30% designated portion for the government. If you don't spell it out, it will affect how private developers do their math. It may not be feasible to put everything in the same building. And what about obnoxious operations? Usually in the government land grant, some operations are barred. I want to know whether exceptions will be allowed. Also, Secretary, will they be allowed to sell land titles separately? Because if this is allowed, this may have an impact on the land management. Fourth question, what about selling the idea to financial institutions? Now, you have consulted stakeholders in your market sounding exercise, and that is a good idea. But after all, in order to fund the project, they will need to turn to financial institutions and REITs as well. Secretary. Chairman. About private participation, this is exactly what we want to capitalize on. We want to leverage market forces to reduce government spending on the projects. Now, when the government has a title and the private developer also has title at the same time, whether it will be inflexible. Now, that depends on the land lease conditions. Let me just put it this way. Whether it's a private-public mix of 70-30 or not, we will spell out the intended uses very clearly. We should also wait for the outcome of the next market sounding exercise. Flexibility should be allowed, meaning that we provide a range of possible uses. So at least there will be a range or list of permitted uses. And second, for the 70% of floor space to be taken up by the private operators, we want them to be modern and clean operations. So the 70% of floor space should be taken up by operations of a certain scale. So for modern industries, we haven't just approached private developers who usually develop private residential buildings and commercial buildings. We've also approached investors in the vehicle-related sectors, as well as some financial institutions. We're going to take forward an EOI exercise, and depending on the feedback, we will chart our way forward, and we also note members' comment on the land lease conditions. Next, Ms. Judy Chan. Thank you, Chairman. First, a word of appreciation for the Development Bureau. The issue of brownfield operations has been a long-standing issue in Hong Kong. We have a problem reprovisioning them, and now we find a new way out. I understand that in general there is in principle support from members. It's all about the details, and that is why we are pursuing the administration with the following questions.
I have 3 questions. First, I was looking at the paper and it touches upon the plot ratio. It is ranging from about 5 to 7 times. You said it is about 5 to 7. So does that mean that there will be different pot ratios? So how are you going to calculate the pot ratios? Second question on para 11 of the paper. For the seamless arrangements, because of a shortage of land, it is not possible to have a seamless transfer, and there will be a time gap. So I would like to know, for the operators who are being affected, for how long will they be affected? So what is the time gap that is you're talking about? What is the shortest time and what is the longest time? And also, will you allow space for them to operate during the interim period? And for them, in each relocation will incur costs. So would it be possible to narrow the time gap so as to help them? Would you have other concessionary measures to help the operators? Thirdly, Secretary has talked about the market intention exercise. I think that is very important. So I would like to know when you can come back to the Council in terms of your survey on the market interest. So we do not know about your planning for the moment. We want to build MSVs to help brownfield operators, and also we want to upgrade the operations at the same time. So if there are different industries which are being affected and you don't have a very good planning, there may be mismatches and gaps. Some of the traditional industrial buildings give us the impression that the industries there are polluting and they are not suitable for accommodating modern industries. So I hope that you can give us a more definitive time frame and when you will come back to us. This is very important.
呢嗰度咧，
Secretary,
工廈咧一定係高密度嘅發展嚟嘅。咁如果我哋講高密度嘅發展咧，一定都會係呢個地積比5或者之上㗎啦。咁但係點解會有啲係5，有啲係6，可能有啲係7咧？其實都真係要好睇嗰個地塊，佢周邊嘅地區嘅交通配套啦，同埋佢周邊嗰個地區嗰啲人口啊、使用者啊，咁所以呢啲都係經過做規劃研究出嚟嘅建議嘅。我哋今日講5至7咧，其實洪水橋嗰度嗰2個大嘅地塊咧，嗰個地積比係7嘅。近住元朗工業村嗰啲咧係5嘅，即係話我哋唔係浮動嘅，只不過呢個5至7就係我哋自己嘅目標，能夠做得到嘅，起碼都要做到5，越高就越好添。
So we try to have different pot ratio according to the different sites. Well, we now mainly rely on monetary compensation, and also we try to provide other forms of assistance for the operators. So there will be a time gap. According to our experience in the past few years, we have been trying to clear some of the brownfield sites as well. And there are about 30 hectares of such land involved. So for these brownfield sites, we appreciate the operators' cooperation. They sometimes try to identify the sites themselves. Sometimes the government let out land through STT, although this is small in number. So it all depends on the intention of the individual operators. In the past few years, we only have a small number of brownfield size clearance. But between now and 2026, we're talking about 200 hectares of brownfield sites which will be affected by development. So that's why we have to work harder to try to find sites for them to accommodate the operations. You were asking us whether we can do so seamlessly, but I can't tell you for the moment. I can't give you an exact timing for now. How about the survey of market interest? We have several considerations Today we talk about the first batch of sites after site formation, which means they will be available for sale. We can only do so by end 2023 or early 2024. So usually before a land sale exercise, we try to have the more appropriate land sale conditions, and we can't do so too early. Well, we try to conduct a consultancy exercise earlier, but that one is kind of, looking at the framework. But when we look at the specific site, we have to be more precise. And we have to see whether we want to put down the land use, say, should it be modern logistics or should it be vehicular maintenance? So it is an art. So we are hoping that in the first half of next year, we'll be able to conduct a market interest exercise, and then we'll be able to put out the tender in the latter half of next year. So, Secretary, I think time is pressing, and also it depends on the market situation before you can set out the land sale conditions. So, would it be helpful for you to come back to the panel, or would there be other ways to go about it? Some members may have suggestions or comments on the land sale conditions. Can you take that into account? I think maybe after the completion of the survey on market interest, when we have such information, then before we put out the tender, we try to provide the information to this panel. In the interim, if members have other suggestions, you are welcome to pass them to us. So first round of questions have been completed. Ms. Chen Yip-ming would like to ask the second round of questions. Well, for this agenda item, we have set aside a time for discussion, and we have overrun it already. So, Ms. Chen, I would only allow you 2 minutes for your second round of questions. So after your question and the Secretary's response, then we will complete discussion of this agenda item, and we'll move on to the next item. Ms. Chen, 2 minutes, please. Chairman, a quick question, Secretary. You have given us a very comprehensive answer. We are now talking about innovation and technology. Now we are in the age of internet. I have visited one of the logistics companies in Zhangguanou. It is fully automated, and the company operator tell me that for modern logistics, they have faced a lot of constraints like the development density of the building and also the floor heights. So in future, will the government take this into consideration? And would you have more measures, try to review the legislation and facilitate the development of I&T? Secretary. Chairman, this is actually a difficult question. If it touches on innovation and technology and as to how the relevant legislation can help out, I think I have to go to the relevant policy secretary to give you an answer. Well, this is related to development as well, because they are facing a floor height issue. Oh, if we are talking about the modern industries development, the consultant we engage has focused on industries. For the use of site for I&T, we will be having an industrial center in Shantin. And so the relevant bureau is looking into the issue. If we're talking about the industries other than I&T, the consultant has focused on modern logistics, construction, recycling industry, and also vehicle maintenance. They have gathered some information on the loading and the floor heights that are required. So we have such information, and we'll reflect that when we conduct the tender exercise in future. Well, I think we have enough discussion on this item. So now let's move on to item 4, the proposed recreation of a supernumerary AO staff grade C post in the Development Bureau. Secretary, we will continue to stay with us. Also, Mr. Wek Yao will stay with us for this item. I know there will be an introduction by the administration on the paper, and there will be a PowerPoint. So who will be taking us through? Deputy Secretary, Mr. Yao? I know time is pressing, so I will try to be brief. The proposal is to recreate a supernumerary AO staff grade C post in the Development Bureau. We propose that the post to be recreated for 2 years. If it is supported by the FC, it will have immediate effect and run until the 31st of March in 2025. We actually have a post taking care of the relevant issues, but that post has lapsed in March this year, so that's why we propose to recreate the post. On the main duties, it is actually related to the item that we have just discussed right now. This colleague will be responsible for the action related to the brownfield sites. They will try to assist the brownfield operations. And there will be the new proposal of building multi-storey industrial buildings to accommodate the brownfield operators who have been displaced. And also, we are having streamlining of the development-related statutory processes. It is in full swing, and we think that we will try to take the amendment bill to the Legislative Council within this year. So the post holder will have to follow up on this, and also the implementation work after the legislative amendment exercise. Also, the post holder will be responsible for further increasing land supply in Long Kou Tan, Tuen Mun West area. And for the brownfield operations, there will be clusters of land. It will also fall under this colleague's purview. Again, it will be supporting the revitalization of industrial buildings and also a funding scheme to support the use of vacant government sites by NGOs. Also, this post holder will work with the EDB to conduct a consultancy study on agricultural priority area, and we hope to complete the study by 2023 and 24 and take follow-up work. As I have mentioned, so all these works touch on important policies. They have to liaise with outsiders and relevant stakeholders within the government. So we need a directorate grade officer to take charge of the work. For colleagues of similar ranking within the Bureau, they are all very stretched and they don't have the spare capacity to undertake such work. So the proposal is to create a post for 2 years, and we anticipate that some of the work I've mentioned will have been completed, some may be ongoing, but our proposal is to recreate the post for 2 years, and we will conduct a review after that. Thank you. So members who would like to speak, Mr. Lau Kwok-fan, 4 minutes, please. Thank you, Chairman. For the duties to be undertaken by this supernumerary post, he has to focus on brownfield sites, the development of MSBs, also reclamation projects, etc., and also the agricultural priority area. So actually, it involves quite a work, and I support this proposal of recreation of the post. But for this supernumerary post, it has lapsed for about 6 months. So what is happening during these 6 months? If you know that the post will lapse, why can't you create it earlier so that there will be continuity? Now you have stopped the post for about 6 months and then you come back for recreation. Why are you doing that?
副主席嘅提。
Mr. Yao, Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Member, for the question. In the interim, within the Bureau, our colleagues have taken up the relevant work, and in terms of our work with the Legislative Council, we give priority to different tasks. So on this occasion, after the summer recess, we do our best to come back and seek permission for recreation of the post with the Establishment Subcommittee and Finance Committee. So that's a matter of priority we have accorded. Right, understood. A follow-up question. The post was first set up in 2018. And the post holder was tasked a number of duties. Apart from revitalizing industrial buildings, I see a different work portfolio now. May I know if this post holder completed all the work as set out, or the work will be delegated to other colleagues? For example, a 2017 study, a territory-wide land use review, and a planning study. And also, what about greenbelt sites that we often discuss? To give policy advice on the future use of greenbelt sites. I see that it doesn't come under the proposed post. Does it mean that these tasks have been reallocated to other colleagues? Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Member, for the questions. About the main duties and responsibilities we put forward on the last occasion, this post holder will be taking forward the majority of these duties. And in fact, he now encompasses a wider scope of duties, for example, to take forward legislative amendments to speed up development. This duty will come under the post holder. And about the study on new development proposals such as replanning of Tumen West area, again, this duty will be taken up by this post holder. I think that we only highlighted some of his duties in the presentation. But if you make a comparison with the duties and responsibilities of the previous post holder, you'll see that it's comparable. And on this occasion, we have set out more duties and responsibilities. Right, so that's an expansion comparing to 2018. There's quite a lot on his plate, in other words. I'm going to support the proposal. I just want to know whether you have sufficient manpower to support this post holder in completing all these duties or fulfilling these duties. Mr. Michael Tan, I have two questions. I just need 1 minute and then I'll give you the floor. One of the responsibilities of this post holder is to support NGOs in using vacant government sites. Now, $20 billion were set aside in the last term of government for Labour and Welfare Bureau to purchase sites. Now, do we have a shortage of supply and unmet demand, or the other way round? Why is it that we need to support the use of vacant government sites by NGOs? Second question, revitalization scheme of industrial buildings. We have been talking about this for many years. Can we see some results? Can you give me successful examples of revitalized industrial buildings? Do you have any targets? You have 3 minutes, 12 seconds. Who will take the question? In relation to the first question about the use of vacant government sites by NGOs, we have a checklist available. Some may be vacant school premises. Usually, as we take forward this scheme, we would first consult government departments as to whether there are other uses. As for the other scheme the member mentioned for welfare uses, frankly, the sites may not be situated at well-connected locations. So the social welfare department, not even the social welfare department, finds it appropriate to use the sites for welfare purposes. Whereas for NGOs, they may come up with a variety of uses. For example, a rural center in the countryside, a training school for guide dogs for the blind, etc., or a pet adoption center. These are facilities that do not require good connectivity in urban districts. So I'm quite sure about the scheme. And I welcome other suggestions from members so that more NGOs can apply. About revitalization scheme of industrial buildings, there were a number of rounds. In the first round, if my memory serves me right, over 100 industrial buildings had undergone wholesale conversion because we waived the charge, and then we allowed redevelopment and increase in building height and density. And under that relaxation scheme, we received a lot of applications. And since then, we've heard views from the sector encouraging us to continue with this scheme, such as paying standard rate premium for redevelopment, whether we can regularize the arrangements. And in fact, in this year's policy address, we have made it clear that this is our way forward. So we have revitalization of industrial building, we have redevelopment as well. But most people opt for redevelopment instead of revitalization. In other words, revitalization scheme only exists in name when people opt for redevelopment instead. Revitalization and redevelopment go hand in hand, meaning wholesale conversion and redevelopment. In some cases, redevelopment may entail a lower construction cost and better future uses, so it may be a more reasonable option. Well, it's for the title owner to decide which approach to take. Dr. LAU Ip-keung. Thank you, Chairman. First, about recreation of a supernumerary post in the Development Bureau to take forward the various land planning and development initiatives. There isn't much a reason to object to the proposal. In the past 2 decades or so, the government has been acting too slowly in land creation. We're just trying to catch up. So hence the manpower proposal. Our people are also result-oriented. I don't think there will be much objection from the public. My question is rather that if the supernumerary post is good for just a short period of time, very soon we'll come back and ask for an extension. So even if you ask for a longer term, I'm going to support your proposal. Now, in relation to the policy objective, I think this is of essence. What is the government's thinking? It has nothing to do with how many posts you create. So, following our previous discussion, I think there is one crucial link not spelled out in the paper, and that is developing idle sites. Only 1/4 of land in Hong Kong is developed. That means 3/4 are left idle. So for brownfield operations, sports activities, sitting out areas in the residential neighborhoods, these are not idle sites. If you want to do anything about them, there would be controversies. Sawmills, ice factories, etc. These are not sitting on idle sites. For a century, we have created land through reclamation and developing land. Say Sha Tin. Sha Tin now houses 1/10 of overall population in Hong Kong. If we were able to do it in the past, why can't we do it now? So I strongly suggest that you develop idle sites. Forget about judicial reviews, forget about the long process. You may not be able to tackle all the issues here and now, but if you don't make a start now, this issue will continue to trouble us for a long time. So whether you call it greenbelt sites, whether you call it the periphery of a country park, never mind about what the sites are called. I think the essence is to develop idle sites. If you can do that, you don't need to worry about agricultural priority area, because on the periphery of country park, it will be an ideal location for developing agriculture and animal husbandry. So I think there's a mismatch here, and it's all the government's doing. Sorry, I need to air my grievances, Chairman, but in fact not so much grievances. I'm just pointing out exactly what the problems are. The member's time is up, but Secretary should like to give a response. I think by idle sites, the member is actually referring to undeveloped sites. We have greenbelt sites, country parks, farmland, and we've been doing our level best. We are taking forward the studies in phases. Resources are limited. Even for the Development Bureau, it is quite impossible to kickstart studies for each and every piece of undeveloped land. And the planning work is not overseen by this post holder. We have other units in the Bureau taking up this responsibility. For example, reviewing greenbelt sites. The review is underway. It's overseen by another team. I think Dr. Low is reminding us about expediting the work and kickstarting studies for, say, the idle sites. Two more members would like to speak in relation to this item. Do we have other members who would also like to speak? In the interest of time, if there are no other members who would like to speak, then after the two members have spoken, I will formally ask members whether you agree to the submission of this item to the Establishment Subcommittee for further consideration. All right, two more members. Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Chairman. Now, I'm not opposed to recreating this supernumerary post. It was previously established. I just want to take this opportunity to make my views clear. I understand that the government has been making an effort, but the progress is too slow. Increasing manpower may not be the best option. I've been advocating wider use of technology, leveraging on the data the use of data in the smart city so that we can save manpower at different levels. And I hope that in the future, no matter the task, you can map out the work very clearly, because especially when it comes to planning, very often you need to involve the effort of different bureaus and departments.
方法係咪一個
So we have to see whether the measures we have been using is the most effective. Also, I noticed that the workload has been increasing and our officers are being subject to greater pressure. But to increase headcounts may not be the best option. So I hope the administration will try to make more use of technology instead of just creating posts. Deputy Secretary, thank you, Mr. Lam. I agree with what he just said. As I have responded to the question of the Deputy Chair, we're saying that although the workload has increased, we are actually trying to adhere to the previous establishment, and we hope to enhance efficiency. And Mr. Lam has pointed out the greater use of technology. We fully agree. We are increasing manpower, but then of course we have to be more efficient, and use of technology would help enhance efficiency. As I have pointed out earlier, this post has to take care of the relocation of the brownfield operations, and we have to provide more support measures for the operators. And one way is that if the operators try to apply for some planning permission, we'll try to provide assistance. And in consolidating the information, we actually try to use the data that we have collected, and we try to consolidate them. So we are also looking at the use of big data. So I agree with Mr. Lam that we should try to employ more technology in improving our work. Yes, I think points have been taken on board, and we hope that with additional manpower, you will also increase the efficiency. Next, Mr. Hon Chau. Thank you, Chair. On the recreation of this supernumerary post, I have a point to make. There are several meetings happening today, and I'm sorry that I may be repeating some of the points that you have mentioned. It is talking about the study on the Long Ku Tan and Tuen Mun West study. We are talking about 440 hectares of land in total here. Secretary, I think you are aware that I have made the point that this is a very important study, the Long Ku Tan and Tuen Mun West study. For the Long Ku Tan reclamation, I think the citizens are most concerned what will be the uses of the reclaimed land. For Tuen Mun West and the Long Ku Tan area, I think in the past, there may not be facilities constructed that are most welcome by the citizens, but unfortunately it's already there. We have landfills, we have Corumbaria, we are going to have another incinerator there. So these facilities may not be that welcome. But with the location of these facilities in the area, the citizens do not have any other facilities as kind of a compensation. The citizens have been urging for a new road and a more comprehensive transport network. Secretary, you know that the road is actually up to capacity. You don't have a new road. And then you're only doing widening as certain bends of the road. So I hope that for this time you're creating this post for this study. Can you give us an undertaking? That is, when you commence the study for Long Ku Tan and Tuen Mun West, you will consider locating new industries there. For example, like modern logistics. I think the key is to make use of this opportunity to provide new industries and create jobs, and then also try to improve the traffic and transport arrangements there. For the North District, in Longshan, there is a tunnel, and you know that traffic there is very smooth. But why can't the same thing be repeated in Long Kou Tan and Tuen Mun West? In the past, the government has conducted a study on Hong Po Road Tunnel, but because of cost and other factors, it has been put in the back burner. So today, you are now going to create a post for this study. I hope you will go back and try to seriously think about making use of this opportunity to improve the traffic arrangements there, and then also to try to create more jobs in the area. And also, you will create more jobs for people in Tuen Mun. So I would like to hear the administration's response. Thank you, Chair. Secretary. Chairman, for the Long Kou Tan Tuen Mun West study, as for the direction of the study, we will defer it to our submission later when we try to create a post, and we will try to see what questions the consultant would need to answer then. But for the moment, in the past few years, the strategic location of this site has increased a lot. We have the Daoizhou Artificial Island, we have the Guangzhou Cow Bridge, and then also the Northern Metropolis. So if on the western part of the Northern Metropolis, if you move a bit further down past Jinbeizhou, you will be in the Long Kou Tan area. So the whole area will actually be undergoing changes, and there will be new economic activities like modern industries. That will be the major direction. Because of the geographical location, such development will definitely happen. But I will provide the details when we come to you for funding of the study. So 4 members have spoken on this item, and I heard that all 4 members are in support of the proposed recreation of this supernumerary post of an AO Star Grade C post in a development bureau, and they support that the paper be put to the ESC for consideration. So any further members who would like to speak? Any objections? If not, I think we all support this proposal, and we will submit the paper to the Assessment Subcommittee for consideration. So we have completed discussion of this item. Now we move on to agenda item number 5. Proposed measures to update and streamline the compulsory sale regime. So please invite the relevant government representatives to join us. So members who would like to speak, please press this button. First, we welcome the government representatives for discussion of this agenda item, and I would like to ask administration to introduce the paper to us. There is a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Chair. I will give members a brief introduction of the paper. This time we are trying to review the compulsory sale regime. We have 2 objectives and 2 principles. First, we hope that we can expedite the redevelopment of the rapidly aging building stock. Secondly, for redevelopment, we would like to strike a balance between development and the protection of the property rights of the private citizens. We know that the buildings have been aging quickly, and the redevelopment pace is not quick enough to catch up. So this is some simple statistics. For the past 10 years, every year, the number of private buildings being redeveloped is only about 160, and this already included the houses redeveloped by the URA and the private developers. But at the same time, for the same 10-year period, buildings which are aged above 50 actually increase about 480 every year. So you can see this is much greater than the 160 buildings being redeveloped. So for the past 10 years, buildings that are aged above 50 accounts for less than 10% of our total building stock, only about 8.9%. But when for the past 10 years, it had increased by about 10%. So the buildings that are aged about 50 has increased sharply. So the pace of aging building is quick, and we can't just rely on the redevelopment projects by the URA. We have to defer to the private sector market forces. So for the proposed recommendations, we want to lower the application threshold for redevelopment. For buildings which are aged 50 and above, our proposal is to lower the threshold from 80% to 70%. Also, we want to increase an additional tier. So for the older buildings which are above 7 years of age, the threshold will be lowered to 60%. Also, we would like to promote development of industrial buildings. Now for industrial buildings that are above 30 years of age, the current threshold is 80%, and we propose to lower the threshold to 70%. So apart from lowering the application thresholds for compulsory sale, we also want to facilitate the development of adjoining lots. The current system lacks flexibility. If the buildings are in the same lot, they have to be connected by common staircases. So you can see that on the right-hand side, although these buildings are adjoining to each other, they cannot come under the same application, and they have to be sold separately. Otherwise, they cannot use an averaging arrangement to calculate the undivided lots. But you can see that if we have a larger site and we can combine the lots that are adjoining, there will be advantages for planning and to avoid the development of pencil-shaped houses. And also, sometimes there may be a gap because there will be no one to come and redevelop a small piece of lot. Also, for a larger site, the utilization will be better, and also the building design can be enhanced. So when we talk about the averaging arrangement of the calculation of the percentage, we also propose to have a weighted averaging percentage and to take into account the size of the site area. So if it has a larger site, it will have a higher weighting. Another proposal is that we should allow applicants, if they have adjoining lots and they actually wholly owned some of the lots, it can be included in the same application. So the objective is to allow for the development of a larger site so that there will be more optimal use of land and better planning. So the applicants, when they submit the application, at that moment, they may own wholly of the same building. Or we see that in some circumstances, when they submit the application, they do not have 100% ownership of the lot. But while they are waiting for the application to be processed and before the case is heard by the Lands Tribunal, during that period they are able to acquire 100% of the shares. So our proposal is that such cases should also be included. So all these proposals aim at facilitating the development of adjoining lots. And also, we will remind ourselves that we want to protect the interests of the minority owners. So we will require the applicants for these adjoining lots, for each of the lots, they have to acquire no less than 60% of the shares. So that is sort of the baseline threshold that we're having now.
We will also impose a requirement on joint redevelopment of adjoining lots so as to make sure the expected benefits will be realized. We also want to clarify the position of certain provisions, as in the past 20 years, for certain provisions, there have been some controversies. For example, we want to make more expressive provisions of the terms age and state of repair. Regardless of the threshold, how the compulsory sale operates is that as long as the threshold is met, an applicant can then make an application with the Lands Tribunal, and then the Lands Tribunal will have to consider whether to make an order for sale, and the tribunal must be satisfied before making such an order for sale that the redevelopment of the lot is justified on the basis of age and state of repair. So if the Lands Tribunal is not satisfied on the basis of the age and state of repair of the development, then no redevelopment is to take place. However, there have been some uncertainties for both minority owners and the applicants. We've made reference to case laws and case authorities and the tests conducted or the adopted in a number of cases, and we want to codify the tests. For example, in relation to state of repair, we will spell out the relevant criteria to help the tribunal's assessment. For example, whether the state of repair of the building is such that it has rendered the building a substantial danger to the residents or the public at large, or whether necessary maintenance and repairs will be more frequent and extensive, making the continued operation or occupation of the building not economical. And in the past 20 years, when the tribunal considered whether the redevelopment is justified, basically the tribunal will have regard to the age and state of repair. So we will make it clear that these are the two factors that the tribunal will be confined to consider in order to minimize disputes. For the 100 plus applications that have been approved, we find that actually the majority or the minority owners have no dispute with the redevelopment. The bone of contention is more related to the later stage about compensation. So if all buildings are above the age of 50 in the same lot, and if all minority owners have no dispute with redevelopment, then we propose that the applicant is no longer required to provide expert reports, etc., to justify the redevelopment, and that the tribunal will be dispensed with the time in reading through these reports. Now, in relation to the above proposals, members may be concerned about more minority owners being affected in the future. And we bear in mind that we need to enhance the support for these affected minority owners. Since 2011, the government has engaged an NGO to conduct outreach support services and also public education programs to educate the prospective affected owners about compulsory sale arrangements, and we understand that there is more to be decided, and therefore we are going to set up a dedicated office to provide a one-stop service for affected minority owners in relation to the initial stage of compulsory sale and afterwards in relation to litigation matters and also relocation. More assistance will be provided. Say when they receive notification of a compulsory sale application, the office will encourage them to engage in mediation and also assist them by providing independent third-party valuation on the value of properties. And there will be access to professional or expert services such as lawyers. And if minority owners cannot afford a lawyer, the office will provide bridging loans. In fact, upon completion of the compulsory sale hearing, minority owners may be able to reimburse the professional fees paid, but there may be a liquidity problem meanwhile, and this office may provide bridging loans. As mentioned just now, if they are required to move out after the compulsory sale proceedings, if need be, support services will be provided to minority owners and tenants for them to find a new place and blend in the new community. Apart from setting up a dedicated office, we also propose amending the legislation so that affected minority owners and tenants may stay in their properties during the buffer period so that they have sufficient time to look for a new place. This is at the moment not spelled out in the legislation, and affected minority owners may be concerned. So we are going to introduce this requirement in the next legislative amendment exercise. So that concludes our presentation here. Our next step is to conduct a public consultation. We're going to consult professional institutes, industries, owners, organizations, etc. We do have ample time to consult different sectors of the community. Our aim is to introduce the amendment bill into legislature in the latter half of next year. So meanwhile, we will continue to brief different sectors and consult them to further improve the bill. Thank you. DS? Well, our panel has also received written submissions on this topic. In fact, we received some submissions just today. We're going to forward the submissions to the administration, and would the administration please provide a written reply for our reference? I understand that you're going to conduct a public consultation and you'll continue to receive views from the public. The floor is now open. Members, if you want to speak, well, in fact, members have indicated they wish to speak, and there are 8 of them. Let me read out the names. Mr. Edward Lau, Deputy Chair, Mr. Chen Hao-feng, Mr. Michael Tian, Mr. Vincent Cheng, Ms. Doreen Kong, Mr. Andrew Lam, Ms. Judy Chen, and Dr. Dennis Lam. In the interest of time, I'll just give each member 4 minutes, questions and answers included. Mr. Edward Lau. Thank you, Chairman. to expedite redevelopment of dilapidated buildings and to address the issue of urban decay, I support the proposal to lower the threshold for compulsory sale. But I'm concerned about the interests of minority owners and the conflict among owners. In some old buildings with few units, just a dozen units, for example, or just 4 to 6 units, no matter how you lower the threshold for compulsory sale to 70 or even 60%, just a couple of owners would affect the ultimate outcome. So there should be more safeguards for minority owners, especially for buildings with few units. I wonder if it's appropriate to relax the threshold to 70 or 60%. Second question. Old and dilapidated buildings cannot proceed with redevelopment because of fragmented ownership, and that is different titles held by owners. And we have now, if the single title blocks are to be redeveloped into multiple title buildings, this may entail costly land premium, and private developers or even the government will not consider redeveloping these so-called one-house buildings or single title buildings. So compulsory sale may not give them a lot of help. Are there other measures to address this issue? Secretary, Chairman. Now, original intention is to focus on redevelopment of older buildings. Then, because many buildings are now above the age of 50, we should not stick to the 80% threshold. Instead, we should lower the threshold. But once we do that, say if a building has only 4 owners, then if one of the 4 owners disagrees, then that means 75%. Now, it's all about our original intention. Next, we also need to amend the legislation to provide sufficient safeguards for minority owners. Now, that's the first point. Second, as mentioned by Mr. Lau, say on a single land lot there is only one title. In these cases, on many occasions, reader has floated the relevant issues. And in other words, before the CFA judgment, it was easier to take forward redevelopment without paying land premium. But now, because of the judgment, it's likely that land premium will have to be paid. All in all, we need to respect the court's ruling, and on this premise, try to relax the regime. But it will be difficult to revert to the previous practice of not paying land premium in redevelopment projects. Mr. Chen Hongfeng. I understand that in terms of public housing redevelopment, the government insists that rehabilitation and maintenance of public housing is a better option than redevelopment. So public housing estates will not be redeveloped. But that's the other way around for private buildings. We have the 2 different versions from 2 different bureaus of the government. Which version is true? Don't be a sore loser. I'd like to have the government's response, please. And in 2020, there were some 19.6% or close to 20% of buildings reaching the age of 50. That's 1/5. By 2040, the same group will take up 50% of the total building stock in Hong Kong. But that's not just about private buildings. That's about the whole of Hong Kong, meaning that by 2040, if over 50% of private buildings in Hong Kong will reach 50 years of age, then, Secretary, are you inflating the figures as a threat for minority owners to just sell out their flats cheaply?
Point number 3, we are all aware that the older the building, the less bargaining power do the minority owners have. So when you try to push for this policy, are you trying to snatch private property because the minority owners do not have a good bargaining power, and then the big developers can try to squeeze them out? This time you also talk about the adjoining lots. For the adjoining lots, I think the small developers, they cannot participate in redevelopment because if the lots are adjoined, it is a much bigger site. It will be a higher threshold for the small developers to join. So there will be a situation that only the major operators calling the shots. Secretary has pointed out that by 2011 you have set up an outreaching team, but no one is aware of that. Well, for the outreaching team, they participate in the compulsory sale regime. But we've learned from citizens that is prior to the acquisition of the title, there may be pressure on the minority owners. So how are you going to protect the small property owners? Secretary, I have a few responses. On redevelopment, we are trying to redevelop private buildings and profit buildings. Mr. Chen is asking whether there is a difference in the handling. I think the Housing Bureau has been saying that they will try to redevelop the sites gradually. I think the difference is that for public housing, we have the Housing Society or the Housing Authority, which are statutory bodies. They are overseeing the housing units, and they try to look at the maintenance of these buildings. But for the private buildings that we're talking about, most of them may not have proper maintenance, so there is a difference between the two. We are proposing to lower the threshold for compulsory sale. This question is actually similar to another one raised by another member. It is asking whether some of the buildings will be easily acquired by the developer. So for how low can we go with the threshold? And for this, we will listen to the views of the community. Now we are talking about buildings which are older than 50 years, and we lower the threshold from 80% to 70%. But for the older buildings, should we go for a lower threshold, say 60%, or would you think that we're being too aggressive? Because some of them may involve only a small number of owners. So we are prepared to listen to the views. On the relaxation to facilitate development of adjoining lots, the question is whether it will facilitate the big developers. I think we cannot estimate about the play of market forces. I think we would go back to our original objective. Why do we want to talk about adjoining sites and facilitate their redevelopment? We are seeing that for the redevelopment of adjoining sites, it will be more optimal use of the land and be beneficial to the community. And if under this situation, the smaller developers would try to focus on smaller sites. So I think We are not trying to facilitate the major developers. That is not my objective at all. Mr. Michael Tan? Well, your time has run out because you have used 3 minutes to ask your questions. So please use other means to raise your questions. If there is further time, I would allow another round of questions for you. I will only use 1 minute to ask my question. Secretary, I always want to go to a restaurant that sells pigeons. It had 160 years of operation. It was originating from Guangzhou. Now there are only 4 branches in Hong Kong. They are all housed in their own properties. But I don't know whether you have been there before. The owner has told me that he will cease operation if the properties are not owned by him. But I think these operators, they are not able to afford market rental. If they are compelled to sell the units, then I think it is very unfair, because for these operators, they've been trying to be the breadwinner for their families. Today, the pandemic situation is getting better. We are trying to revive our economic activities. If you talk about compensation under compulsory sales, then I think it is the opportune time for the developers to do so. But for the owner users, it may be the worst time for them, because they have undergone threshold for compulsory sale of 90% and 80%. I don't know whether this time they can survive a lower threshold of 70%. My worry is that these collective memories of Hong Kong citizens will be erased. So we have to move on for our society. So what I'm thinking is, with the lowering of the application thresholds, this is actually not an opportune time for the owners to roll this out. For the Lands Tribunal, they may use the figures back in 2018 and not the figures for the recent years. For the rental of the shops, it will be much higher a few years back. If you're trying to have compulsory sale now and then the economic situation goes back to normal, then I think they will lose money. So I think a lot of the owners are trying to leave their properties vacant. Well, the restaurant that I would like to go to may decrease in number from, say, 4 to 2. So a lot of our collective memories are being lost. So can you share with us your thoughts? Secretary, if I have not mistaken about Mr. Tian's point, is that in future, when the Lands Tribunal conduct the evaluation, they should not just look at the evaluation at a particular point in time. And this is a detailed point. I note that, and I will go back and see how we can address this. In the past years, the Lands Tribunal has been operating smoothly. They have handled a lot of applications for compulsory sale, and they have got information from the estate surveyors. They have acquired experience over the years. So we'll try to see how we can take the economic fluctuations into account when they conduct valuation exercises. Chairman, if you allow me, I would like to raise a related point, which is also touched upon by Mr. Chan Hock Fung. During the early stage, before we go to the process of compulsory sale, some property owners may have their shares acquired. So there may be people contacting the property owners earlier. So how can we assist them and help them? We have actually think about that internally. The problem is where to draw the line. if we look at property sales and transaction, it is happening every day. So when is the good point in time for the dedicated team of the government to go in and provide advice? It is not easy to look at the timing, because we don't want to be too interventionist. But I note your points and your suggestions. Chairman, I want to clarify. After 2003 SARS, there has been a long period of time when there is an economic trough. So don't just use those years for calculating the valuation. Well, no one knows what will happen, but I think the Secretary has heard your points. So for very short-term fluctuation in valuation, please see how we can try to avoid that. My understanding is that it will not just look at the figure for a month. I think they look at the information for the past 3 years or so. But for some cases, if you look at the past 3 years, the case may not be beneficial to the minority owners. Next, Mr. Vincent Zhang. Chairman, I think we have to be very careful here with compulsory sale, because for the minority owners, the property would be the most important asset for them, or their last piece of assets. So we have to exercise caution and we have to protect their interests. I understand that for some of the buildings, they are aging and they need to be redeveloped. But I think we have to be careful. I have 4 questions. It is stated in the report that in 2010 there are about 3,900 old buildings, and the figure will increase to 87,000 in 2020. So this is a big number, but for the past there are only about 400 compulsory sale exercises. Is it because the threshold is too high, or are there other factors that affect the number of applications? With the lowering of the threshold, will the question be resolved? Would there be other measures? Well, I want to declare that I am a member of the URA. I think for the Yaoshimong and Mokok area, we try to introduce new elements so that there will be new developments in the area. With the lowering of the application threshold, and also you think that there will be adjoining lot applications. But I imagine that there may be single building lots that will be constructed, and it will affect sort of the community. The third point, you're saying that you will set up a dedicated office. So where will this dedicated office be accommodated? Well, last time the dedicated office is housed under the rating valuation department. But if you're trying to create a new office and employ a lot of staff, but you are not reachable to the public, then it's useless. And if you employ the NGOs, it also may not be effective. So it is important where you're going to put this dedicated office. Lastly, I agree with Mr. Tan. In the past, we are trying to preserve some of the special localities. I'm now trying to help a number of shops selling the handheld mahjong tiles. And then we also talk about multi-storey industrial buildings. So let's try to look at some of the things that we want to preserve. Secretary. On the figures of the old buildings, it is mentioned that since the establishment of the LCSRO, there have been 400 applications, and 170 of them have been granted the sale order. So what is happening to the remaining cases? Actually, about 200 of the cases, they have been withdrawn or curtailed. And this is actually very practical because some of the minority owners, they will have more communication with the majority owner, and then they have resolved their issues. So there is no need to put the case further to the Lands Tribunal. For the URA, its function can help with the compulsory sale. But I think it is not possible for ULA to conduct all the redevelopment of our old buildings. I was hoping that they will try to redevelop areas which may generate that much economic benefits. They are actually not trying to make money, and they would have to come to the government for resources. But for the market forces, we hope that the private sector, with the enhancement of the compulsory sale regime, there will be more cases for redevelopment. For the dedicated office, we are hoping that it will be put under the land registry. The land registry is a trading fund, and it is more flexible, and also it has all the information about the properties in Hong Kong. So we hope that the land registry will have a dedicated office, and then they will provide assistance and support to the minority owners. This is our thinking at this stage. During the process of compulsory sale, I want to stress that this is a process operated by the private sector. If there are some of the shops with history that needs to be retained, I think, as I have said, we have to rely on the dedicated office to provide information and assistance to the shops concerned. And it is difficult for us to use public resources to assist these shops with a long history. Well, for example, maybe we can refer them to the URA or some developers who may have space to be rented out for these shops. We can try to make the referrals.
In short, you can also use the revitalization partner scheme, revitalization of historic buildings through partnership scheme. Mr. Ng Kong. Thank you, Chairman. I agree that we should expedite the redevelopment of urban districts, but I have reservations. I asked some veterans in the council, and accordingly, the legislative intent of the LCSRO in 1998 was that if we're unable to trace the owners of dilapidated buildings, such as 3 new buildings, then the 80% threshold is reasonable. Now you're going to lower the threshold so that even if you're able to locate all the minority owners, you will still lower the threshold and make them agree with a compulsory sale. This is a departure from the original intent. Only 10 applications or so succeeded under the regime. We have 8,700 buildings or 27,000 buildings. Well, even if we approve 300 applications each year, it will take 33 years to process all the applications. For example, it takes 10 to 20 years to acquire titles for a building, and there is great distrust among the owners and the major developer, and then there is a lack of transparency in the whole process. And it takes another 2 or 3 years for the court to finally hear the case, and then some more time for the legal proceedings themselves. And about the reserve price and the compulsory sale process, the public that do not understand the process, and the legislative amendment doesn't seem to address these issues. My second question is, can we really expedite cluster developments through lowering the threshold? We have saved 500, 600 units for this building. So we're talking about some several hundred owners comprising the 20–30% of the land title. Like Mr. Chen Hao-fung said, if this is not done properly, it will sound like we are depriving the rights of minority owners. So I am concerned because there may be more confrontations between redevelopers and the public. And just by its name, it leaves more to be desired. What is meant by compulsory, such as can we learn from the Singapore model so that all title owners can take the initiative in approaching developers themselves. Say if they're able to gather 70–80% of title, they can take the initiative and apply with the government so that within a 1-year period they can approach developers on their own. And failing that, the validity period will lapse, and this will empower owners and address issues of mistrust. In Singapore, the government also assists the public by providing standard templates and acting as a facilitator in gathering titles. So I think the government should not just bulldoze it through. Secretary. Chairman. Ms. Kong just gave us some comments. We're still in the process of consulting members, so I'm not going to give a consolidated response here. Safe to say that when the member said whether we can allow owners to gather titles on their own instead of pushing through a compulsory sales regime, I don't see any conflict here. In fact, even as of now, owners can gather titles on their own and approach the developers. I'll defer to the Deputy Secretary to explain that. Ms. Kong referred to the collective sale regime in Singapore, and we do have something similar in Hong Kong. There is a subsidiary under URA, and that is the Urban Renewal Intermediary, which started to provide the same service in 2001. If owners are able to gather at least 50% of the titles of the building, then they can approach the URA for help. That is to collect the remaining titles, at least up to 80–90%, so as to meet the compulsory sale threshold. This is quite similar to the consultancy service in Singapore. The URA will help process and issue tenders and invite interested developers to place a bid. We believe the collective sale mechanism and the compulsory sale regime can go in parallel. Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Chairman. This is a broad topic. Without digressing, I just want to focus on what we've been discussing. That is how we use market forces to help minority owners. And I'd like to make a few points. Lowering the threshold is one way of adopting this compulsory sale regime. There are other bottlenecks, including resources for the Lands Tribunal, as mentioned by other members. When I comment on the market factor, I'm not referring to the objective factors, but rather a subjective one. For some minority owners, they refuse to sell because they know that under the government's policy, the URA provides a rather high reference price for compensation. So we may not be able to achieve what we expect to achieve if we lower the threshold. In considering whether a building should be redeveloped, we need to consider the state of repair. And this means any owner can create a favorable condition to meet the state of repair criterion. And this affects not only owners but also occupiers. In other words, whilst we lower the threshold, we also need to step up inspection on building maintenance to make sure that this factor is not man-made. And next, to my understanding, the 60% baseline threshold is very low. If it's purely commercial, then I can't argue about that because we're, after all, practicing capitalism here. But if we exercise public power to assist private developer to acquire titles, then even if we're only talking about assistance given to the 60 or 80% of majority owners in acquiring the titles from minority owners, that we're still exercising public power. And on this note, of course, I welcome the establishment of a dedicated office, but we need to be mindful of the points I just mentioned. I have 2 more points to make. Now, as mentioned by other members, we have cases of old shops, and we have cases involving services in the community, and they're part of the community, and they must stay in the same neighborhood. Another point is that at the initial stage, there are a lot of uncertainties. So before applying for compulsory sale at the title acquisition stage, I think more information should be provided for owners. Mr. Lam, you've gone on for 4 minutes, so I'm afraid I can only ask the administration to give you a very succinct reply, just within 1.5 minutes. The member mentioned some bottlenecks, including resources for the Lands Tribunal and the procedures. We have liaison with the judiciary. We would like to streamline certain administrative procedures on assistance to minority owners, and that we should intervene at an earlier stage. And we have noted members' comments and we'll give it a thought. Another point was raised. The URA's compensation package, and that the pricing seems to be on the high side, and that not even the private market can offer a comparable rate. And for the level of compensation pegged to a 7-year-old building, well, we usually will continue to improve and enhance the policy. If we backpedal and ask the URA not to adopt this level of compensation, then that's really hard to do. On the contrary, we hope the URA rates would provide an incentive for private market to follow. And I do agree that we can enhance the dissemination of information. On building maintenance, I agree, as I have been in touch with some minority owners, that they may just want to sit on their hands and wait for redevelopment instead of putting in more resources in the proper maintenance of buildings. And that's a real issue we face. And at the same time, I agree with the honourable member that we should just sit on our laurels and wait for redevelopment. So as we lower the threshold, we will also step up building inspection. Ms. Judy Chen. According to the administration's paper, for buildings above the age of 70, we have some 1,000 or even over 1,000 such buildings. So there's been a substantial increase. We have an aging society, and we also have rapidly aging building stock. So in principle, I agree that we should update and streamline the regime, but we need to be careful about the compulsory sale regime. Because if we lower the threshold to 60% for buildings above the 70 years of age, it may be counterintuitive. We may not be able to help minority owners. We may be favoring major developers. So I need to be careful.
So I have two questions and two suggestions. I was looking at the paper, and when we try to look at the test for the age and the stage of repair, that is for assessing these two criteria. So I would like to know whether these two tests have the same weighting, or the test for age is more important than the test for stage of repair. When we look at some of the buildings, you will see that if they are well maintained, the situation may still be quite good when it is even 70 years of age. But you are lowering the threshold to a very low level. So I would like to know whether we can hold on to the test of state of repair more importantly. That would be better to protect the minority owners. Secondly, Secretary, you mentioned that there may be some loans. You said that you may consider providing loans for the minority owners. So what would be the criteria for dishing out these bridging loans? And for the suggestion of the dedicated office, why don't you put it under the Home Affairs Department? Because the Home Affairs Department is actually providing a lot of legal advice service, and also they are undertaking mediation well, and they have close liaison with the owners' corporations and the 3 new buildings. So why don't you put the dedicated office under the district offices? Another suggestion, why can't we tackle the issue at source? We are now trying to catch up. We are now trying to tackle the older buildings. But for the buildings which are being constructed now, what will happen to them in 50 years? For building maintenance, is there any policy for pushing the current owners to do more on the maintenance of their buildings, have more popular education on this aspect, please? Thank you. On the tests of age and stage of repair, I think these two tests are stated in the current legislation. You are asking which one has a higher weighting. When we look at the cases dealt with by the Lands Tribunal in the past, I think there is no one case that the tribunal only considers the age of the building. Also, we notice that there may be a few cases. The stage of repair may not be good, but then the buildings are not very old. Since they are not well maintained, the tribunal has actually issued an order of sale. With the proposed legislative amendment, we want to state the things clearly. We want to put down in the legislation that the factors to be considered by the tribunal, as explained by the Deputy Secretary, we will have a whole list of factors. Well, these are not dreamt up by us. These are actually collated from the previous cases handled by the Lands Tribunal. So usually the tribunal would take these tests into account. So we want to say that clearly in the legislation. On the bridging loans for the minority owners, so that they can engage experts and also provide for valuation reports. So we are now in the consultation stage. If the community is agreeable that we provide the bridging loans for the minority owners, we will try to do so. we suggest that this dedicated office should be put under the land registry. There are actually several reasons. The first one is that the land registry is also under the Development Bureau. So it is better to have everything under the same bureau instead of we have to cross over to another bureau. Secondly, for the professional assistance to be provided, is related to the planning, the valuation of the lots concerned. So it is also related to the development aspects. So it is not helping the minority owners to form owners corporation like the job being conducted by the Home Affairs Department. Next, Dr. Dennis Lam. Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, I support the lowering of the threshold. I hope that we can try to balance the interests and the demands of the developers and the minority owners. I have two questions. On paragraph 7 of the paper, it is stated that for 70% of the buildings, that is about 700 of them, they have only about 4 units or less. So for the threshold, we are lowering that to 60%. Then I don't think it will work well for these buildings because they have to, if there is only 1 unit, they have to get 100%. And if there are 2 units, they would need to get at least both units. If there are 3 units, you have to get hold of consent from 2 units. So it is difficult for these buildings, although you're lowering the threshold to 60%, but because of the small number of units, the threshold is actually still quite high. And then I think these buildings has taken up a lot of the land in Hong Kong, so the land utilization rate is very low. So I hope that there will be some special arrangements. So for these buildings which have very few number of units, can you lower the threshold to no more than 50%? Because if there is only 1 unit, you got to have the consent of the whole 1 unit. But for cases where there are 2 units, you can get the consent if you only have support from 1 of the 2 units. So there will be some practical assistance. So we are trying to look at the different percentages and see whether the government can consider that. In June this year, and up till now, there are only 3 successful cases. Oh, sorry, you're talking about 3 cases which have been dismissed. In Toko Wan, that case lasts about 8 years, but they still fail because they only have 70.9% of the shares. And the developer said that the case failed because they provided a compensation of $18,000 per square feet, but there is a gap of 12.5% as to the demand by the minority owners. Well, the property market prices is actually going downhill, so I think the prices to be offered by the developer would also decrease. But then the property owners, the minority owners, they would try to stand firm on their case, and they will not be accepting a lower price for compensation. So we hope that redevelopment can go ahead. So for these buildings, can you give some policy concession for the developers? Can we have exemptions for them so as to encourage the developers to redevelop more of these old buildings? Thank you, Chair. Secretary. On the first question concerning the threshold, for the old buildings which are of 70 years of age or higher, the current proposal is to lower that to 60%. So that means if there are only 3 owners, I assume that they have the same proportion of shares. If 2 of the owners are willing, then they will have 66% of the shares and they can reach the threshold. But if you lower the threshold to 50%, I think it may be difficult at this stage, because I noticed that some of the members are saying that lowering the threshold to 60% is a bit aggressive. In the past, there have been cases that the tribunal refused to issue an order of compulsory sale. There have been 4 cases which have been rejected. That is because they cannot reach the thresholds. So members suggested, because the minority owners are asking for a great amount of compensation, can we provide other incentives for them, so that the major owner, that mostly the developer, they can think about such initiatives. We haven't thought about that at this stage, because the discussion today has given us the impression that the lowering of the threshold may be controversial. There may be concern from certain sectors of the community that we are trying to help the major developer and not taking into account the interests of the minority owners. So we haven't thought about providing further incentives for the developers at this stage. Next, Ms. Darili. I think for the community, we generally support that we should speed up the redevelopment of old districts. But as to the methods that need to be deployed, it still deserves some discussion. I have served some of the old districts. A lot of owners come to me to say that we should urge the URA to expedite urban renewal. But for the citizens who come to me, most of them hope that the URA would come in for redevelopment rather than the private sector. If you compare the two, you can easily come to a conclusion. For the private development, there is lack of transparency. The developer usually try to acquire the shares through some third parties, and some of the measures adopted by them may not be that good for the minority owners, or may even be intimidating. Also, there is lack of information and lack of support. They do not know how to go about a compulsory sale, and the minority property owners also do not know where they can get hold of the relevant information. You try to lower the threshold and want to expedite compulsory sale, but you haven't provided the necessary support services. So for the private redevelopment, generally would cause some concern for the citizens. Some of the minority owners, they want to redevelop their property, but they want the LURA to do so rather than the private developers. And they have some concern about the major developers and the agents employed by them. So if you want to expedite urban renewal, I think you have to look at the support measures as well. You're now talking about providing support service. I think it is better late than never, but you have to work harder on that. Also, I think we have to win the hearts of the minority property owners. We understand that we are now following the majority rule, but there is no alternative for the minority owners, especially for the buildings with a small number of units. I think you are lacking in promotion and publicity. You are not providing support for the minority owners. So you are trying to look at the demand-led measure, but I don't think you have a lot of successful cases. So why are you not successful in that respect? You are just waiting for the property owners to come to you, but they are not that capable. They are not even aware of the scheme that you are running. So by the end of the day, you give people the impression that they are forced to sell their property. So please let us know about the success cases of your demand-led compulsory sale scheme. How can we let the minority owners know that they actually have a choice, and let them know that they should understand their rights? So apart from selling their flats to the developers, I hope they can sort of form a core unit and then they can sort of sell their properties collectively.
Secretary, I thank Ms. Starry Lee for her reminders on the compulsory sale regime and that we should provide support services. One point is that the government has not been providing support in the past, and this time round we should make some enhancements. Next, about the lack of transparency. At the initial stage, when the developers acquire titles, there is a question on the point in time when the government should start to intervene, and we should go back and give it a thought. And about owners' collective action, especially when that building doesn't have a lot of units, we consider how a multi-pronged approach can be taken so that we also encourage owners to take collective action to take forward the sale of building. Right, since I'm the last one to speak, Chairman, apart from you, may I ask the administration how many successful cases have been undertaken under the demand-led approach? Yes, for the demand-led pilot scheme, we had 9 successful cases. As for the joint sale, we received some 40 applications. So far, 1 case has been successful because in terms of application criteria, there are a number of conditions. Say the site should be of a certain size at the moment. And there are limitations. So, like the Secretary said, perhaps we can go back and give it a thought and see how we can improve the regime with the URA. May I also take this opportunity to ask some follow-up questions? First, about the collective sale or joint sale mechanism, like Starry Lee said, it hasn't been very successful. This could be a misunderstanding. About the joint sale arrangements, as mentioned by Ms. Starry Lee, it did not yield good results, so the government should work harder on this front. And about the dedicated office, as Ms. Starry Lee just now mentioned, this is something you can do now. You don't need to wait for the outcome of your consultation. You can start now and do it as quickly as possible, because in any case, minority owners will need more support from the government anyway, because for the major developers acquiring titles, they have more bargaining power, whereas the minority owners are disadvantaged. Now, and since I'm biding time, I'm asking members to come back to this room for the next item, which we need to vote on. Let me ask this question. You have a lower threshold for buildings above the age of 70, and we're now having this discussion on whether we should lower the threshold to 60%. What about different land lots on which there are buildings of different years of age, and also in a more complex situation, say if an industrial building is involved, if you take the averaging arrangement, then do you base your calculation on the building with which is the youngest? Let me defer to the Deputy Secretary to explain the situation with the aid of the picture in Annex 6. Right. We've prepared a backup slide, and that is a weighted average. let's say in this case there are 4 lots with different sizes. The larger square means this lot has a larger size, and then the second entry lot area, and then building age 1 is 56, 58, 48 and 65. Then under our proposal, different thresholds should apply, and then as Secretary mentioned, in Annex 6 we calculate the weighted average, and that is a percentage. Under this principle, if the lot is larger in size, then greater weighting should be given. So that's about the percentage, and that's example in Annex 6. And then the overall application threshold using weighted average should be 71.3%. And as mentioned just now, we want to avoid a situation in which the percentage is particularly low, say just 40%. So apart from the weighted average approach, we have another requirement, and that is the baseline threshold should be 60% for any lot in any application. Right. You should make sure that the government does a good explanation to avoid a misunderstanding of your proposal. So that wraps up the discussion of this item. We thank the administration for coming, and we thank the Secretary for coming. We still have another item. Item 6. Let me first invite the administration to come in. This is a funding proposal in relation to drainage improvement projects in Yuen Long. So may I remind members that in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure, if members have any direct or indirect pecuniary interest in relation to the item being discussed, then the member should only speak after he has disclosed the nature of the interest. So let me welcome the administration to our meeting. I will invite the administration to walk us through the paper. I understand that the administration will do so with the aid of a PowerPoint. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members. There are 3 drainage improvement projects in Yuen Long, and we'd like to seek member support for the funding application. So as introduction, let me brief members on the 3 projects. For the red squares, these are village areas, and we're going to improve the drainage system there, and we're also going to revitalize the nullahs. As you can see in Yuen Long, the catchment will then go back to Yuen Long, and then you will see a green and the green and beige colored lines here, and that's the nullah in Yuen Long Center. What we will do is deodorization, and I will explain in a moment. We'll also revitalize the stream. Then the water will then flow all the way to Shanpui River. But before reaching that outlet, at the outlet, we're going to implement a barrage scheme. And since Yuen Long is flat and low-lying, and at the same time accommodating 170,000 in the center, in the Yuen Long Center, and another 100,000 in Yuen Long South, then the area is prone to flooding and the backflow of water, and we therefore need to address the possible flooding incidents by implementing this scheme. Now, as I explained, because of the topography, During heavy downpours, the area is prone to flooding. So we'd like to address the issue in the long term. As mentioned just now, we're talking about some 270,000 population being served by the drainage system here. So the main part of the project is this one. It's located at the outlet of the channel. Water goes through the Nulla to Chan Pui River, and at the moment the level of water is high. It goes above the Nulla, so we put flood walls here. But during heavy downpours, together with high tides, backflow could occur, leading to flooding. And in light of possible extreme weather in the future, we need to implement the project to address the issue in the long term. So, as you can see, we have an orange curved structure here. This acts as a flood barrier. This panel will be lowered during low tides to facilitate the flow of the stream, and during high tides it will be raised so that there won't be a backflow from the downstream. And then during downpours, the stormwater pumping station will be activated to prevent rainwater from flowing back to the downstream. And we have a video clip here. When there is no rain and no tide, the flood barrier will be opened to maintain the brackish water ecosystem and thus the ecological connectivity. At times of heavy rain and low tide, the flood barrier will be opened, allowing the rainwater to naturally flow over the flood barrier. At times of greater flood drainage needs or during high tide, the flood barrier will be closed and the stormwater will be pumped. There are 6 pumps altogether with good capacity. It can drain 1 square meters or cubic meters of water in 1 minute. So that's the photo montage. We have the stormwater pumping station and also the flood barrier as indicated here. This is the main part of the project, which will entail quite a lot of time and money. The next part is improvements of Yunnan Town Nulla. Well, this is affected by dry weather flow because of misconnection or wrongful connection. In winter, in the dry season, there is a problem of odor. It needs to be addressed. In other words, at the outflow section of Yunnan Nulla, we're going to install the dry weather flow interception system. Now, as you can see, during the dry season, when there is little water, this dry weather flow interceptor will be installed to collect the sewage, and then it will flow into the box culvert to be sent to the pumping station, so as to prevent backflow to the Nulla. And during rainstorms, large amounts of rainwater will first of all provide a steady flow, and it will also go to the Yunnan Nulla. So it will be diverted to the harbor. And as you can see, on the left hand side, this is the Nulla before improvement, and we want to improve the Nulla so that after improvement there would be an ecosystem built, so that the area will be beautified to become a landmark in Yunnan, and meanwhile people can enjoy the scenery there. Apart from revitalizing the section near Chan Pui River, we're also going to revitalize this section in the urban district. And again, this photo montage shows you what happens after the improvement. People will be able to enjoy the scenery. And we consulted the public and the community, including the Yuen Long District Council and the various committees. They all expressed support for the projects. Now, on construction program and estimated cost, the works will be completed in phases. For example, for the dry weather flow interception system, it will be completed in 5 years. We're only able to work during dry seasons, so the actual time needed for construction is about 1.5 years. On the right-hand side, as you can see, this project entails a cost of some $3.7 billion, and it's for the barrage scheme, and it is less costly comparing to other similar schemes. And this is also much less costly than the alternative, such as building a reservoir. So this is the more affordable option. This part is about improving the drainage capacity of the rural area.
The next slide, when we look at the villages, there are a lot of village pipes, and we want to revitalize some of the channels and also improve the environment. So these are the areas that we would like to improve, a photo montage of the improved situation. We have consulted the rural committees and the relevant committees, and the cost is stated in the table. So we hope that with panel members' support, we can submit the 3 items to the PWSC and then the Finance Committee, and then to commence the necessary work. Thank you. Thank you, Undersecretary. So time for members to speak. So 3 members would like to speak. Mr. Hon Chow, 4 minutes, please. Thank you, Chairman. On the town NOLA and the dry flow sector, we have been talking about that for a long time. For the Yuen Long residents who resided on both sides of the NOLA, they have given us a lot of complaints about the odor of the NOLA, and we hope that the works will be expedited. And now I noticed that the works will take about 7 years to complete, and I hope that the administration can speed up the project. Now for the barrage scheme, I have read the paper and listened to your presentation. You're talking about a cost of about $3.7 billion. This is a very expensive project. Can you let us know whether this project will benefit not just the residents near the Shanbui River, but all the residents of Yuen Long? Is that the case? Second, have you thought about other methods to deal with the situation? You talk about building reservoirs, but can you let us know, for this similar scale of work, what would be the cost, so that we would understand that you have think about alternatives, but then you go for the barrage scheme because it is cheaper. Otherwise, $3.7 billion looks like a big sum of money to me. Undersecretary, let me supplement. Thank you, Mr. Chow, for your questions. On the cost of the project, it seems to be very expensive. Maybe I didn't make myself very clear. This area is actually for the collection of all the rainwater in Yuen Long, and that is the outlet for all the rivers. So if there is any blockage, it does not affect Shanbui River, but the whole community where about 270,000 people are residing. So if we proceed with this project, then I think for the coming 50, 60 years, the flooding issue will be resolved for the community. So this is a very strategic project, and it is sort of the last stop for the outflow of the water. Second, we have thought about other alternatives. Another method that we have used in the past is the building of the reservoirs. You actually have come to this panel for getting money to build a reservoir in Tsim Sha Tsui. But for Yuen Long, the topography does not allow for that. So when there is rain, so all the water will be coming down and the volume will be great. Our assessment is that we cannot have the similar facility like a flood storage point to be built in here because it will have to be about 10 times the size of the one that we're building in Tsim Sha Tsui. So we have to find a space. We have to do excavation, so it is not practical. Apart from the technical difficulties, in the case of Tsim Sha Tsui, we have to use about $700,000. So we have not go for a detailed design because we think it is not a viable option. But that gives you an idea of how much the project will be. So you can see that in the case here, the barrage scheme is more viable, and it is also similar to what people in Singapore are doing. On the timing for the Yuen Long Town NOLA, we would complete the works in about 5 years, and then we need about 2 years for the vitalization of the NOLA. But as I've said before, we can only carry out the works during dry weather, so we have to complete the works in about over a year's time. Mr. Michael Tan. Chairman, we want to build the Yuen Long barrage scheme to prevent the backflow of water from Shanpui River. But when there is wet weather and there is a heavy typhoon, it is quite unlikely for the situation to happen, and then our streets will be flooded. For the last 2 major typhoons, we have flooding, like Mankat. But it is not often for us to have such a heavy typhoons. Now we have to spend $3.7 billion. But do you think we'll be able to withstand heavy rain from typhoons similar to that of Hatu and Mankat? Those cases are only once in a blue moon, so I don't know when we will face the same situation again. So in other words, what is the chance of facing heavy rainstorms like that? Well, to me, the most important point is about the Yuen Long pedestrian. Last time it was rejected by members because it is too expensive. This is not related to the project that we're talking about, but I have been discussing with the Highways Department. They are actually coming up with a cheaper alternative, and they will present that to us in due course. But now you are providing a lot of works improvement related to the NOLA in Yuen Long Town. And if after the completion of works, then another department will come to us for a pedestrian flyover or walkway, then I think it will not be conducive. So for the next PWC, can you let us know whether you would liaise with the other department as regards the works related to the elevated pedestrian corridor in Yuen Long? Well, thank you for your questions. For us, generally, the drainage projects, we are trying to cater for situations which will be met once in a 200 years. So we are talking about the volume of the rainfall that we will face. So we are talking about 145 millimeters of rain every hour. For now, the black rainstorm signal, we are talking about 70 millimeter of rainfall. But our design is to cater for 145 millimeter. So it is kind of like a double of the rainfall that we will get for a black rain warning. What about the rainfall for the other typhoons like Mankat and Hatu? Sorry, we only have the average rainfall at hand. For Hatow, the average rainfall is about 80 millimeter. For Mangkat, is about 50 millimeter. So this is the average. Well, I want to know the maximum amount. I think we can provide the information to Mr. Tan in due course. But when we look at the design of the town Naula, we have been liaising with the highways departments. So what we will be done here will not affect the construction of the elevated pedestrian corridor later. So that means they have to wait until you complete your works before highways department can come in. Well, we have discussed that with the departments. Maybe I'll defer to the engineer from DSD to take this question as to what discussion they've been having with the highways department. Mr. Choi? Thank you, Mr. Tan, for your question. When we designed the Naula, we have been looking at the water flow and also the construction size. We note that in future, if there is the need to build the elevated pedestrian corridor, they have to put in piling. And when we design the Naula, we have already taken into account the piling for the pedestrian walkway. So our hydrographic study has already taken into account the requirement to build pilings for the pedestrian corridor. So we have already taken the situation into account when we design the hydrographics. So I have to follow up with the highways department. Thank you for your answer. For the information to be provided in due course, Mr. Tan has touched a point about the rainfall volume and also the duration of heavy rain. Does it happen within 2 hours or 3 hours? Can you provide such information in writing? Let us know the capacity. Mr. Choi, you want to supplement? On the volume of rainfall, as the Undersecretary has pointed out, when we designed the Naula, we tried to cater for a rainfall of 140 millimeter. For the typhoon of Mangkat and Hatow, we found that for Hatow it is about 80 millimeters and it is about 4.4 meters above sea level. For Mangkat, the rainfall is 50 millimeters, the volume is higher, but it is 4.303 above sea level. So these have already been taken into consideration and will be able to withstand heavy rainfall. So how many times are you talking about as compared to the rainfall by Mangkat? We are now going for a ratio of 6 above sea level. So you are actually having 50% more capacity. Yes, that's correct. So we have actually sufficient capacity, more than enough. So can you also explain to us about the time duration of the rainfall? Will you still be able to cope with that? Chairman, we will try to provide information on the maximum rainfall, the duration of the rain, and also the amount of rain at different time slots. Yeah, let's have the information so that we can ask more questions. Next, Deputy Chair, Mr. Lau Kwok-fan. Thank you, Chair. I think this project would help the case of Yunnan, but these are very expensive projects. So with the building of the facilities, it will help about the rainfall situation in Yunnan. Would it also help with the situation for the Northern Metropolis? Would you be laying some groundwork for the drainage projects in future in Northern Metropolis? Thank you, Mr. Lau. Yes, the short answer is yes. As I have pointed out before, when we try to design the project, we take into account the drainage needs of the whole Yunnan district. And for the Northern Metropolis, it touches on the southern part of Yunnan. So this project caters for the drainage needs of Yunnan South. So for these facilities, it is not just covering the current Yuen Long district, but also the new towns to be built in Yuen Long South. So the $3.7 billion will take into account the needs of the whole NDA, right? So apart from the drainage improvement works, there will be also vitalization of the NOLAs. And I would like to commend you on that, because the NOLA has actually taken up quite a bit of space in Yuen Long. Apart from the odor problem, the visual impact is also not good. So if you can revitalize it and provide a scenic waterway, it will be very nice. And it will become a new spot for the residents to enjoy themselves there. Well, during the design stage, of course, you would go for a very nice design, but sometimes the product may not be exactly like what you have designed. Well, this is a very long NOLA. What will be the maintenance needs in future? And how can you maintain it to be a scenic waterway in future? Do you have dedicated staff to work on that? And what will be the maintenance costs involved?
問題。
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Member, for the questions. First, yes, we do have proper maintenance at the design stage. We're going to choose plant species that that are flood resistant, and the DSD colleagues will be responsible for maintaining the facilities, so that the facility will have flood prevention function. And I'll give the floor to Mr. Choi. About revitalizing Yuen Long Town NOLA, the annual expenditure is about $25 million. As for plants, we have this experience. For example, for the Jordan Valley NOLA, we recently completed a revitalization program, and on plants, we have experts selecting species that can adapt to the environment, that are aquatic in nature. So we have dedicated maintenance personnel. I am very concerned because the construction itself may not be difficult. It's rather more difficult to maintain it in the long term. And this will be beneficial in terms of conservation. You will help conserving the environment and promoting biodiversity. Undersecretary just now referred to this flood prevention facility, which will protect the 270,000 population in Yuen Long. Are you talking about the existing population in Yuen Long or otherwise? My next question is this. Can you explain to me the site boundaries? Because you just cited this figure, 270,000 population, that's a lot. I think the message is well received. But what we have in mind is the magnitude of the project. There may be demographic changes and changes in the distribution of population in the district, and this is a $3 billion project. So because of this big sum, can you further explain the scope of the works? Let me use this slide to explain the project. The catchment is this area marked in pink, as well as the Yunnan South development marked in blue. And for Yunnan New Town, the population is roughly 170,000. For Yunnan South development, it spans 185 hectares. It will house 100,000 population. So that's where the 270,000 population comes from. Any other questions from members?
如果冇嘅，即係我想諮詢在席嘅。
So if we don't have any other questions, may I ask members here whether we support this paper for this item to be submitted to the Public Works Subcommittee for further consideration? And support from members, is that right? So this panel endorses the paper. It will be submitted to the Public Works Subcommittee for further consideration. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members. So next item, any other business? If there's nothing under AOB, meeting's adjourned. Thank you.